Welcome to Executive Access, your home for real talk with industry leaders. I am your host, Jamie Tazi. Today, I am speaking with David Weiss, operating partner at Thoma Bravo. Currently, David works with about 7 growth stage software companies. Prior to Thoma Bravo, he had an incredibly successful career, including leading all of marketing at Citrix, helping grow that company from just over 10 million to over 750 million, and as the CEO of Numera Software, that he grew from 20 million to over $100 million to an exit. When I hung up with David, I looked at my producer and said, Zach, now that is what excellence looks like in business and leadership. Wow. David covers so much ground in describing the tenets of scaling a successful company. We talked about business metrics and the fundamentals. We talked about the criticality of alignment of vision and execution at all levels of a company. And we talked about culture, of course. David created an energy creator framework that he used as a CEO, and now he shares with the CEOs he advises. He walks us through that framework in detail and why a focus on energy in an organization lights a chain of success for employee value creation that leads to customer value creation and ultimately to shareholder value creation. I'm thrilled that I was introduced to David. Get your pens and computers ready. You are going to want to take a lot of notes on this one. Let's dive in. David, welcome to the Executive Access. I'm so thrilled to have you on here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So you're the operating partner with Thoma Bravo today. You work primarily with software companies, and I'm so excited to get into your background and some of your leadership thoughts. But before we do that, I'd love to start with my typical growth mindset question. What are you doing these days to learn and grow, either personally or professionally?
Well, a little bit of both. So I like to think that just by virtue of my job, where I get exposed to lots of different companies and lots of different people, that I'm constantly learning. But one of the things I discovered last year, I was fortunate enough to host a conference of HR professionals, and we had a speaker, a gentleman named Eduardo Briceno, and he spoke on the growth mindset. And one of the things that he talked about is a growth mindset is a proactive, conscious effort, not something that just happens. And he distinguished between what he calls the learning zone and the performance zone. And uh, when you're performing, you don't want to make mistakes. You do what you know best. You don't deviate from the plan. But when you're learning, all those things go out the window. You try new things. It's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are expected, and you learn from that. The example he gave, which was a really interesting example, are Circus LA performers. When they're rehearsing with a net, that's when you try things. You don't try them in the middle of a performance. That could be disastrous. And I thought it was a very poignant, easy to remember example of the difference between performing and learning. And so I like to think that what I've been doing is consciously knowing when I'm performing and when I'm learning, and working with my teams, the management teams that I coach, to know the difference between the performance zone and the learning zone. So that's one thing. That's kind of on the professional side. On the personal side, I'm trying to challenge myself physically. I'm 64 years old, and my boys were hockey players in high school and college, and they decided that they wanted to play with their old man. So they challenged me last year to learn how to play ice hockey. The last time I skated or owned a pair of skates was probably when I was 4 or 5 years old. And skating is not the easiest thing to learn. My neighbors were like, "Why at this age are you taking up ice hockey? Why not golf?" That's what most people do. But I bought a pair of skates. I bought all the equipment. I've been going out when I'm not traveling. I've been going out at 6 in the morning to get ice time and learning how to skate and learning how to play hockey. And when I started, I could barely move forward without holding onto the wall. Now I can skate forward, backwards, stop, shoot, participate in a little drill here and there. So that's what I'm doing to learn. I like to constantly challenge myself and not do what's kind of the normal thing for people to do.
I love that. I can't decide what I love best, that you would pick up such a big sport, so late in life, or that your sons want to play a sport with you. Like I've
Yeah,
I pretty much decided that anything my kids, they're teenagers now, want to do with me is the most interesting thing that I want to do because it means they want to spend time with me. So
there you go. And one lives here in Tampa with us, and the other lives in Miami. So when he was over for Thanksgiving last year, the three of us were able to go out on the ice together, and it made it all worth it. Whether all the falling, all the painful feet, and the sore wrists, and everything else, it was worth it just to get out on the ice with them.
amazing. And on the other piece, the learning zone versus the performance zone, I'm going to follow up with you on that because I'd love to
Okay.
learn more about that. I've been so enamored with growth mindset ever since I learned when Satya Nadella came into Microsoft. I learned growth mindset and have been practicing it and preaching it for years, bringing it to my kids, bringing it to my teams. And there was one video I saw that I thought encompassed it a lot. It talked about how when you're in the learning zone, the most common feeling in the learning zone is frustration. And I was like, yeah,
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I was thinking about that, but if you persevere, and so resilience and perseverance is how you get to success.
exactly.
But I guess what I'm wondering about as I hear you talk about the performance zone is if you're in the learning zone nonstop, which I always like press myself, like we can do it, team, let's go learn, fail, cheat. Like, can you overdo that too? So that's what you've got me questioning with this new pivot. Maybe it's adding something to the great growth mindset work.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's hard to say what percentage of time you'd be in the learning zone, what percent you'd be in the performance zone. I think it depends on, what you're doing, what your business is, what your role is, and so on. But again, if you think about whether it's the Cirque du Soleil performer or a professional athlete like a tennis player, you know, practice, 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 learning zone, try the new forehand, try the spin, that's 90% of your time is doing that, but then when you're in the match you perform what you've mastered. And so if you're thinking about a match as the learning zone, as much as we like to be in learning mode, that's not how you necessarily win and perform,
Really
right? You
interesting.
don't want to try new things. You don't want to fail during that. Failure is okay as part of your learning zone. And some people will fail on the performance. So I hate to say it, but there has been an occasion or two when a Cirque du Soleil performer failed, right? And you learn from that and you go on, but you're not intentionally trying to try new things and practice and so on. So I think it is important to differentiate. And I think it's important for people to know, especially in the role that I play, because I sit on boards and I work with management teams, it's okay to let them know that they're in the learning zone most of the time, because I think especially in board meetings, management has a tendency to think I'm in the performance zone. I can't make a mistake. I have to answer every question that's asked. If I say I don't know, that's failure. That's not really how it works. So I think it's important for people to understand the difference.
Great. And to bring intention to it. Okay. So I'm going to be
Yeah,
ruminating on that a little bit. And you said it's Eduardo Gracino. Gracino. I'll reference his.
Briseno.
Oh, Preseno.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
Briseno.
We'll
Yeah.
reference his work if he has some.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you for those two growth
Sure.
mindset things you're working on. Well, you brought up an operating partner. So, can you describe? I don't assume that everybody in my audience really understands what an operating partner is and does. And so, if you could maybe describe that a little bit and how you arrived at that in your career.
Okay. An operating partner, quite simply, is someone who works with the management team of a company that the private equity firm has invested in to help drive the creation of value through the things that they typically do day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter. So things like their budgeting process, organizational design, hiring, compensation plans, pricing and packaging, the things that you do to operate a business, as opposed to, for example, M&A or refinancing a business or a sale process, which is what the investment team usually works on. So when an investment is made, the operating partner, usually through the role of a board seat, will work with the management team to help work on some specified levers to drive the growth of the business to create the value of the business. So that's what we do. How I arrived there, I think, is an interesting story. I was a CEO of a software company here in Tampa. we had reached a stage where we were getting ready to sell the business. So we ran a process with a banker, and we had a lot of suitors because the company was quite successful. We were very profitable and growing at a decent rate. So I got to see a lot of people. One of them was the private equity firm, Thoma that I work with today. And they put in a bid on the business, but the bid was substantially lower than some of the other private equity firms and some of the strategics had put in. So I called up the partner and asked, why was your bid so much lower than everybody else? And he said, well, the way we make money is we buy companies that are leaders in their space, but are suboptimally run. And then we work on these operating principles to help expand the margins of the business and drive value creation. And your business doesn't really have any room for margin expansion. So I said, well, let me understand
Thank
this
you.
then. Yeah, you're telling me my company is worth less because it's well run. That just didn't seem quite right. Because, well, actually, that's the case here. So I filed that away and said, okay, I got to follow up on that. When we eventually sold the business, I called that same partner back and said, well, apparently you like the way I ran my business. Is there something I can do to help you with some of your investments in your other companies? And that's how I became an operating partner. And that was 14 years ago last month.
I love that story. And prior to that, so you were at Citrix, right? So you were you told me a story where you were employee number 59 at Citrix. Maybe they were only
Was
around 10 million at the time or something. And then you were employee 59 at Numera as well. So
yeah,
there's something
yeah.
special about that number.
It was just coincidence, but I interviewed at Citrix when it was less than a $10 million company at a privately owned company, and I was just amazed at what I saw the opportunity could be. I said I could easily see this being $100 million company, so I joined, and I was employee number 59. And we went into hyper growth mode. We went public 2 months after I got there, and we went from 10 million to almost 50 million to 125 million to near 300 million in 7 years that I was there. We went from the 10 million mark to three-quarters of a billion. And from employee number 59, when I left, there were over 2,300 employees, many of whom I helped hire. So it was really a rocket ship in the day. And then when I left there, I joined a startup company that, again, just coincidentally, I was employee number 59. It's about the same size. We didn't quite get it to $1 billion, but I took it over as CEO, and we got it to over $100 million and sold it, as I mentioned before, and very successful. So I don't know, 59 must be my lucky number.
I love it. Well, and you ran all of marketing for Citrix, so you
I did.
bring a lot of experience and being able to lead through all of those growth stages to the guidance and the coaching that you give as an operating partner to these portfolio companies that you work with. Fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it is important to differentiate. So I got there as a $10 million company. The ideas were already there. So I wouldn't call myself, being employee number 59 at two companies and a serial entrepreneur. My skill set is more in helping businesses scale. So from 10 million to almost a billion, or in second case, 10 million to over 100 million. And that's what I tend to do with the companies that I work with. These companies already have some market acceptance. Most of the time, they're already profitable. Not always, but most of the time, they're already profitable. And I just help them scale. And I think there's a difference between being the ideas person, if you will, and being an operator who knows how to scale a business.
Well, and that skill set is highly valued in these firms. So, what do you see as the growth stages or the big inflection point growth stages of these organizations, and what are some of the challenges that the leaders are facing at each one of those stages?
Yeah. Look, I think there's probably two ways to answer that question. One is companies typically get measured in terms of their size, usually revenue size or ARR, annualized recurring revenue size. Companies are, 10 million, 100 million, 300 million, 500 million, billion. And people tend to measure their stages by that size. There's some truth to that, but I don't like that as the sole measure, because I think there's a difference between a $1 billion company that sells fundamentally a single product into a huge market, or a $300 million company who has 15 different products, is global, multiple avenues of distribution, so on. So I like to think about a company's inflection points as ones of complexity rather than size. So when you have multiple products, the first time you launch a significant second product, that's an inflection point. The first time you go outside of your core geography, that's an inflection point. The first time that you open up a second channel of distribution, whether that's an OEM or a channel partner, that's an inflection point. So I look at those things to understand whether a company is, complex, even if they're small, or if they're relatively straightforward, even if they're large. So I think that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is more unique to private equity. So when you think about how private equity works, they make an investment, they help the company grow, and then they sell it. They're in the business of buying and selling companies. There are stages within that. They're not hard and fast, but I'll give you some rules of thumb. If a private equity firm is going to hold the business on average for 4 or 5 years, you can divide those into three sections. The first couple years is what I'll call the planting. So you can plant seeds that will then grow during the whole period of private equity. So the first stage, or the first couple of years, is the planting stage. The second is the growing stage. So you planted those seeds, those key initiatives. Maybe you've launched a product, maybe you've opened up a geography, and now you're working on those things to grow and produce plants. And then the third phase, maybe that's year 4 and 5. That's the harvesting phase. And that's when you're going to reap the rewards of that. You're going to see the financial numbers kind of take a hockey stick up. And that's when the significant jump in value is created, when a private equity firm would then sell the company. Now, again, those are not hard and fast time frames. Some companies don't go through all three phases. I've had companies that we've held for 9 years. I've had companies that we've held for 17 months. So there's no hard and fast rule. But what's important for management to understand in those phases is, don't confuse planting with harvesting. You're not going to get a receptive year if you go into year 4 and say, hey, you know what? I got this great big new idea.
Huh.
Can we spend millions of dollars and try this? Not in year 4 or 5, probably not going to happen. So I think it's important for them to at least understand conceptually, if not hard and fast, what these phases are.
Excellent. And did you find that what the Thoma Bravo team told you when you were asking for, hey, why is my bid lower from you? Did you find that that was the case, that you could come in and um, add significant value pretty quickly around operational rigor? Or what were some of the components that you saw thematically, not talking about any one firm per se?
Yeah, absolutely. The things that I had done either intuitively or just observing others in my own business are the things that carry forward into working with the portfolio companies that Thoma Bravo had invested in. So a lot of times when we invest in a company, we'll do a day one, then a day 90 and a day 180-day plan, where we look at the company's structure from a number of people, process, how many products they have, all those kinds of things. Put in place the metrics to measure and monitor success in all these areas, and then execute on some key initiatives. Maybe it's to streamline the business operation so that we can scale it faster. And there's all kinds of practices that you do to make that happen. That's scary for some people, because I think, and it's also probably where private equity gets, a bad rap. They think private equity equals cost cutting. That's really not how it works, because we'll never cut our way to a return on investment. If there is cost cutting that takes place, it's usually at the very beginning, and it's to get the company streamlined or get the P&L in order so that we can step on the gas and get more mileage out of what we do. I liken it to building a car. You can have a great engine, very powerful engine, but if the body of the car is boxy and not aerodynamic, you can pour rocket fuel into that engine and step on it, it won't go as fast as it should. So you got to take the whole thing into context, streamline it so that it operates as efficiently as possible, and then you step on the gas. And in almost every case that I can remember in my 15 years, 14 years of doing this, if there were cost cuts at the beginning, within the next 12 months, we've already made that back up in terms of hiring the right people in the right roles so that we can accelerate growth. So again, I think it's important to understand those principles. It's important to understand the measures, but most important is to understand the context of when you do what and why. And it's about getting that P&L, that engine, and the entire car in the proper aerodynamic form so that when you are performing
Hmm.
growth initiatives, you're getting the least resistance.
That's actually really helpful for me because my experience and what I'm hearing you say is it's really what you're looking for is the operational rigor from a metrics standpoint. Let's get the let's get the
Yeah.
basics that, the car built the right way so that we can accelerate. And some of the portfolio companies may, like the one you were bringing in or working with private equity for, had might have really strong baseline, and some might be a total redo, and maybe something in between, right? And that's the piece.
Exactly. I mean, as I said, I work with companies, some, approach $1 billion, some are under $50 million. They'll have varying levels of sophistication and infrastructure. And maybe the $1 billion company will have a lot of these metrics in place, but they may have already gone to the point where there's too many to understand what the real drivers of value creation are. So a lot of that is working with the team to call out the best things to measure, because what you measure in a $1 billion company and what you measure in a $50 million company are largely the same. The complexity of each one, how many independent variables affect each one may be different, but the core metrics are really the same for both of those businesses. Smaller businesses might not even know what to measure and don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. And so we work with them to get those in place. The larger companies, as I mentioned, may have too many things. So it's getting down to the right set of metrics and organizing around those metrics and assigning ownership. You'd be surprised at how many companies, even large, successful companies, you can't say who owns this particular success metric. There's got to be a person that owns it, and responsibility and sort of driving that responsibility down beyond the CEO and CFO and even the executive leadership team is one of the things, especially in a larger company, that we work on to make sure that people understand what is they own and how that feeds into what the people above them own, how that feeds into ultimately what the company's core success metrics are.
Okay, I'm smiling because I don't think I would be surprised. Some of the things that I've experienced or the teams I've even run, creating that clarity and alignment all the way down. So, but a lot of what you're speaking about when you get involved with a company, it sounds like the fundamentals, right? Step
It
one,
is.
really making sure that we have the fundamentals in place so that you can hit the gas and scale. Um,
Exactly.
what are the the other levers of scale that as you work with founders, or maybe it's beyond the founder to the CEOs of these companies, that you consistently see as opportunities for scale?
Oh gosh, there's lots of them. Let me pick a couple. You mentioned alignment, so let me talk a little bit about alignment. It's
Please.
probably, to me, the most important thing that you can have. And one of the things that always amazed me, because Jamie, I know you worked at Microsoft for a long period of time. My days at Citrix, I had a lot of interaction with Microsoft and Microsoft field offices around the world because of our partnership with Microsoft. And I was actually amazed that a company that big with so many diverse products and channels and people and so on actually did a really good job at prioritizing for people. I could go to a field office in Paris and then another one in UK and another one in Tucson, Arizona, and ask them what the 5 priorities for the year were, and they would largely be the same. And I always found that pretty amazing. So I thought Microsoft did a pretty good job. I never actually worked there,
I
but
agree.
from the outside looking in, I thought they did a pretty good job of getting alignment. So to me, alignment is one of the most important things that you can do. Um, and I actually use an analogy of a chiropractor. My brother-in-law is a retired chiropractor, and chiropractics uses the whole concept of alignment to make sure that the body's in tune. Well, if you think of an organization like the human body, there's a lot of parallels here. You know, your anatomy, everything stems from the brain down through the spine, out through the nerves to the body parts, and the brain controls all function, from the head down to the toes. If there's misalignment somewhere, it causes a disruption and in the body is not optimal, or in this case, the organization is not optimal. If you have a vertebrae that's out of place and it's preventing the full, either it's causing pain or it's preventing the full impulses from going to a certain part of your body, what ends up happening is that the rest of the body compensates for it. So, you know, if you have a pain on the left side of your lower back, you're going to compensate by walking differently. And it's ultimately going to create a pain on the right side of your lower back or your hip. And the body gets out of alignment and it performs suboptimally. And a chiropractor basically is responsible for putting up the spine back in alignment so that the body can operate in harmony. The same is true of an organization. Alignment, if you don't have alignment, if people from the top down to the bottom don't know what you're working on, don't know what the key metrics are, don't know what the goals for the company are, there's no way that it's going to be operating efficiently or optimally. And so it's really important to have alignment. And alignment can be really simple. You don't have to have a complex strategy to get alignment. When I ran my business, um, we weren't as obviously not as big as Microsoft, but we still had 500 people, and they were scattered around the world. And so we created a multi-year plan that had three elements. We were going to uh, expand geographically because we were 100% US. We're going to move from SMB into the mid market. So we're going to upgrade our products to get into the mid market, and we're going to acquire adjacent products to cross sell. And everything we did was around those three things. So if we formed a partnership, if we opened up an office, if we um, chose to launch a different product, everyone knew why we're doing that. It fit one of those three tenets of our long-term strategy. And so everyone was in alignment on how we did that. And alignment is, to me, is one of the most powerful tools that you can possibly have. The other, not to ramble too long, but
Oh, can
the
I just
other
speak
to
about
me,
alignment real
yeah,
quick?
sure,
I'm so glad that you
sure.
told me how you did that because I was going to ask you, well, how did you know your organization was in alignment? There is something about the power of three. I don't, there, I'm going to look that up. There's some type of brain science or something around it.
It is.
It's always three things. It's not two, it's not four, it's always three. But then, decision making is tied to that. And, just everything is tied to that, right? So as a CEO, when you were at Numera, for example, all the plans probably locked in with those three things, no matter which part of the organization you were
Everything
in.
we did.
Yeah.
Everything we did
Okay.
locked into those three things.
Great.
I once had a CEO who told me that the reason there were three things on his annual plan was that he wasn't smart enough to remember four, so he had to stick to three. And if
That
he
could
only
be.
did two, yeah, if he only did two, we would think he was lazy. So he came up with three. So that was his rationale. I don't think there was any science behind it. I think it was just his way of saying
That's
these are the
funny.
three
But
things we got
right,
to
it is
focus
always
on.
three. Anyway, I sort of digress.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I love that alignment piece and how leaders at all levels in the organization, if you're mid level, when I was, senior but mid level of Microsoft, the onus was on me to look up, what is going on in those WISM memos. We used to call them WISM memos, worldwide sales and marketing memos or something. That was part of the alignment process. And then as I was looking down, how do I know that the things that I am trying to put out, with my team are being acted on is through the reviews that we put in place and the questions that I ask and things like that, right? So I love this alignment piece. All right, so I kind of interrupted you. You were about to go to another
Yeah, look, I
scale.
probably have, I actually have a presentation that I'm doing to a leadership conference in a couple of weeks for the CEOs of portfolio companies. But one of the other elements in there, out of the 10 that I go through, is culture. Um, Culture, and we could probably spend hours just on this topic, but to me, culture is absolutely critical. So you got to have the right vision and people in alignment, and you got to have the right people, which sounds very obvious. Everybody says you got to have the right people. I get it. Get the right people on the bus, all those kinds of things. That makes sense. A culture is a very different thing than just having the right people on the bus. Having the right people gives you the skill sets, but doesn't necessarily give people a common purpose. And it also doesn't necessarily give the organization a level of energy that it typically needs. And so when I was at Newmar, we created this concept called the Energy Creator Framework. And what it did is we actually categorized all the people in the company into four buckets. There were either people who created energy, sometimes it was chaotic energy, but it was definitely energy. We had people who were energy repeaters, and they tended to absorb the energy created by the chaotic energy creators and repeat it out to the rest of the people. And then we had energy consumers, people who took that, fed on it, and did their day-to-day job based on that. And then, unfortunately, like any organization, we had energy resistors, people who put in roadblocks and so on. And we actually use this framework consciously to manage the organization. We could actually look at a group using things like the engagement scores of various groups and say, why is this group always so highly engaged, even if they had a bad year or they didn't hit their financial metrics, but they're still highly energized and engaged. And it really came down to the composition of the people in the group. There was a good blend of energy creators, energy repeaters, and energy absorbers, and they had done a good job of getting the energy resistors out of the organization. So we started using that across the entire company. We would actually sit down and say, okay, who are the energy creators in the business? Where do they sit? And you'd be surprised. Okay, maybe in a 2 or 3 thousand person organization, it's a little hard to do, but in a 500-person organization, we all knew who the energy creators were. I mean, there was no debate on that. And we actually knew who all the detractors or resistors were. There was no debate on that. Sometimes in the middle to a little bit of discussion, but it was pretty obvious. And then we looked and saw, where do those creators sit? And if there's a part of the organization that's low on energy, could we move one of those energy creators, regardless of their skill set? Maybe they were a salesperson, but maybe we want to move them into service or R&D, just to create some energy within that group
Wow.
so that we had the right composition of creators, repeaters, consumers, and getting rid of the resistors. And we did that as a proactive management tool, every year that I was there. And that's a framework that I give to the CEOs and the HR professionals that I coach. Again, it's not scientific. There's no evidence behind it. It's not all that fancy and academically supported, but it worked for us, and it really drove home the concept of, you got to go beyond just the skill set. You got to go to the culture, and culture, part of culture is the energy. And so that's what we did to drive it. So to get an organization, you got to get in the right growth mode. You got to have the right alignment. You got to have the right culture.
Wow. I love all of this. I have a couple questions to ask about your energy
Sure.
creator framework. By the way, Microsoft had a framework that I still remember to this day. It's probably been 15 years since I was exposed to it, that I still think about it and still use. That's how powerful it was. And it was saying, every manager in this company, we need you to do three things. Of course, three things again. We need you to create clarity. By the way, that sounds like alignment, your alignment word. We need you to
Yeah.
generate energy. And the third thing was drive results. That was very Microsoft, very results driven, right? And
That's
which
amazing. Yeah.
which talks about where we started this conversation with the metrics and the data driven and whatnot, right? So generating energy became this idea that I thought was just a manager's job, right? But I'm hearing you say it could be anybody in an organization at
Anybody.
any level,
Yeah.
which is interesting. So when you use this framework, so just to get really specific, you would sit down with your leadership team and take a look at whatever
Yeah.
block of the organization you were talking about, and put people in the buckets and talk about how that group or
We would.
team would, do we have the right balance here?
We would. We would actually identify by name who we thought energy creators were. And again, it was pretty obvious. I mean, they're just people by their nature. And again, sometimes it's chaotic energy, so it's not always efficient. And if you don't balance that with the right type of energy repeater, somebody who can live with the chaos and then echo it back out in a more organized fashion, then you'll end up in a lot of chaos. And if you have all those energy creators sitting in one part of the organization, It's going to create imbalance. They're going to fight with each other and so on. So it really was a conscious exercise to say, okay,
Oh, interesting.
this group is low on energy. This group is high on energy. We don't have enough repeaters here. We got some detractors here. And we rebalance the organization um, to make it sort of energy efficient. And each of my leaders were responsible for coming to the table with their own sort of within my org. Here's what I can do. And sometimes we ended up going cross org because we said this person's a great energy creator. You need their skill, their energy here, and we're going to move them across. And again, whether it's, I mean, some skills you can't do that. We're not going to take someone who can't write code and put them into a coding function, or take a
That would be bold.
someone. Yeah. But we did a fair amount of
Sure.
sort of rotation,
Sales to
and
service is a great example. I mean, why
yeah,
not?
yeah.
Um, by the way, this idea of why we want to create energy or have energy in an organization, it may seem like an obvious question, but that's me. I like asking obvious questions. Like, so it's connecting what? High energy equals high performance equals high results. High energy equals innovation. High energy equals, what would you say?
All of the above. It gets people to buy into what the business is trying to achieve, and it's a point that I'll probably make again as we talk more. But especially when you're a privately held and owned by a private equity company, people tend to measure value in financial terms, right? When I talk about creating value, it's usually about a return on invested capital for the private equity firm or the limited partners who contribute to the funds of the private equity firm. But you cannot create shareholder value unless you're creating employee value. And so having the right energy level creates value for the employees. They get satisfaction, tangible or intangible, direct or indirect, out of doing what they're doing. And that pays off. And if you have employees who are engaged and energized and doing the right thing, they will create energized customers. And if you put those two together, you end up creating shareholder value. So it really does drive this sort of the chain of success there. Energy creates happy employees, happy employees create happy customers create shareholder value. Again, it's sort of cliche, I know, but it's
No,
it's a
it's,
little bit of a different twist on how you get there.
you know, I, you know, how when you're part of something great or you see something great, you're like, I can see it. I just can't measure it the way I can in a spreadsheet. You can see, I was always involved in Microsoft in these incubation businesses, right? Where nobody had quite figured things out. That's where I got my energy. And some of the best times were with teams who were just like these small, mighty teams taking on outsized competitors. We were doing outsized things in the market, winning deals that we had no business even being in the first place. But the energy that we created and drove it was all about this energy. So you could say, was our product good enough? Our product was pretty good. We had the Microsoft name, but not really in the space I was in. It's all of what you're talking about, right? There is something intangible that maybe a different set of people with a different set of energy wouldn't have been able to do those things, right? This is the first time that I've heard of a way to actually bring a leadership team together to talk about how you can be intentional about creating. I think it's fantastic. I would love,
Also gives people a raison d'etre. When you're creating products that have significant sort of globally accepted value in the market. Maybe you're creating a medical device and it saves lives. Okay, people get that, and it's easier for people to work on something like that because they know what they're doing is for the greater good,
sure.
right? When you're creating spreadsheet software or Microsoft Dynamics accounting, ERP systems, or in my case, it was help desk. Look, I like to think it made people's lives a little easier and stuff worked and there was return on investment, but it wasn't changing the world. And so, how do you get people who are working on those kinds of things to have the same level of commitment and energy that people who are working on things that saves lives, cure cancer, fight war, all those kinds of things, have the same level of energy on things that are not as tangible. And this is the way that we did that. It gave people a reason because everybody got the infectious energy, and you don't get that unless you consciously or intentionally manage it.
I was trying to figure out most of the time where do I sit, which of these buckets, and I have to be honest, I really want to say I'm an energy creator. Maybe I am a little bit, but that energy repeater really speaks to me too, right? Like
Yeah,
taking some of
I
these
am.
visionary ideas and being like, yeah, we can get behind this. I'm going to make it better and bring the real world to it and all that kind of stuff, right? Like as you said.
Well, it's a really good point because I was the CEO working through this framework with all my team, but I am clearly not an energy creator. I'm much more of an energy repeater. And that's probably why I went to work for like Citrix as an example. The founder was a huge energy creator. A lot of founders or have that,
Hmm.
Steve Jobs, force field around them,
Totally
right?
visionary.
Yeah, that's high energy, high chaos. I'm not that kind of person, but I can take some of that and put it into an operational plan and help scale a business. So I'm clearly an energy repeater.
Okay. Oh, good. Then I'm in good
So
company.
that,
I'm
yeah,
gonna stay in that bucket too. All right. I have to ask you before we move on this topic, but the energy blockers. Okay. One mistake
yeah.
that I have seen, I have done myself, maybe earlier in my career, especially, is letting that negativity stick around. I mean, especially when it's a high performer. It's a high performer, somebody who constantly drives results, right? Yet we would put them as an energy blocker. What's your advice for a situation like that?
Um, the instant that you have questions or doubts, it's time to make a move.
Hmm.
And I don't mean that callous look. I'm a people person. Managing people and letting people go is not an easy thing. I don't take it lightly. But you're going to have to, if you're a leader in the organization, if you're the CEO of an organization, whatever, you're going to have to manage that for the greater good of the company. And as soon as you have your doubts, it's probably not going to get any better. So I'd say, we've all made that mistake that you just talked about, which is hanging on too long. Especially salesperson who's killing the number. That's really hard to get rid of. But yeah, it's not going to be good in the long run. So as soon as you have those doubts, it's probably not going to rectify, and you might as well take action at that point.
Okay. That's somebody who's listening today, David, needs to hear that. That's a really tough one. But
It
yeah,
is
the
hard.
because the damage that they can do to the overall culture that you're trying to create is not worth the benefit and upside to
No,
their performance.
no.
Okay, great. I love this framework. I know that a couple of the leaders that I work with on a regular basis that listen to this podcast are going to be asking me to talk about this with them in our next conversation. I just know it. So thank you for that.
Go for it.
So you talked about like the importance of the metrics, and then it's funny when you said that you recently led a functional summit for HR professionals. You said that to me when we first met last week, but I told you I was surprised to hear that. I was like, oh, I would have expected something more data driven or your background in marketing, maybe. But when you said that you had passion for leading this functional summit in HR, I didn't get it, but I think I do. But maybe you can explain. Is there anything else relative to culture that has you passionate about leading that up?
Yeah, when I reflected back as an operating partner, I reflected back on my time as a CEO and thought about literally if I were to write down how much time I spent doing everything. I spent probably 25% of my time with my CFO because we were owned by private equity and I had to understand, the financial performance of the company. And it wasn't my background. I think I'm a pretty good learner on that stuff, but I relied on him. And, so I spent a fair amount of time with him. Uh, I probably spent 40 to 50% of my time with the head of HR because the thing that I could do as a leader was help drive the culture forward by creating the direction, that three-pronged plan that I spoke about, gaining alignment and clarity around that, and then managing the culture around that. That's what I could do. And so for good or for bad, HR leaders tend to be the owners of culture. I can talk a little bit more about that. I don't think they should be, but that typically is what happens. So that's where I spend a fair amount of my time. And then the remaining time, 35% was amongst the rest of the functional leaders of the organization. So when I was an operating partner and I looked and saw that we had these summits for sales leaders. We had them for the CFOs. We had them for professional services. There was no one doing a cross portfolio summit or discussion group, however we want to call it, for the HR leaders. And so in you know early 2020, I decided to partner with the internal HR leader at the private equity firm and form a summit. And the timing was couldn't have been better because that was 2 months before COVID hit. And suddenly the HR team went from an important but probably relatively passive part of the executive leadership team to being in the hot seat at every company that I worked on and every company that my colleagues worked on because, oh my God, what are we going to do? Employees can't come to work. It's a lot more than just getting them remote access. How do I keep a remote employee workforce engaged? And so, again, right or wrong, the word engage meant it's the HR leader's responsibility to figure out how we do that. And so it sort of became a COVID mentoring group for the first year, and then we expanded to other topics. And when the real world allowed us to get back together face to face, we started getting together once a year face to face. In fact, we have another one coming up in about a month. And so it just became a passion of mine, understanding what it did to drive success at my company when I was a CEO. I wanted other companies to have the same level of importance placed on culture and on passion. And the quickest way to that was through the HR leader. So I started that forum and we keep going strong today.
Wow, I love this. I'm learning a lot just by putting this podcast out in the world. And there's been now a couple of CEOs that talk about how they did not appreciate the importance of the HR function and of culture until they were in the role.
Yeah.
um, and so I think that there's great learning in that. And then on the flip side, I've interviewed a few senior HR professionals, one who said to me, traditionally, the HR leaders haven't really had as big a seat at the table as other leaders on the executive team. And when you put those things together, you're like, okay, there's massive opportunity in what you just said, making sure that that's becoming 40 to 50% of your time as CEO working in the HR function is
Yeah.
significant. Okay.
That's a lot. Well, when I first started doing the operating partner role and we would have whole board meetings, um, you never see the HR leader at a board meeting. And in fact, I would say 90% of not all of my companies, the HR leader reported either to the CFO or a COO or somewhere else in the organization. And it was viewed as primarily an administrative function. Over the course of the decade and a half, whether it's because of COVID or more enlightened CEOs or whatever the case may be, in all my companies now, the CHRO or chief people officer, whatever title they use, is a true executive. They sit at the table with everyone else. They report to the CEO, and they are viewed as a business partner to the organization,
Love
not
that.
an administrative function. And it's taken some time, and I like to think I had a little bit to do with that, but I think it's also just the world we live in elevated that role because of the changing dynamics of the workforce, whether it's COVID, whether it's millennial work habits, whether it's the great resignation, whatever it might be, all these things are really impacting businesses. And, the HR leader is the one that's sort of most versed and most skilled, to handle these trends.
Well, and as I go reflect back on there's a lot of things I'll be reflecting on like late into the night, I'm sure, as I think about this conversation. But when you talk about your chain of success, employee value leads to customer value tied back to shareholder value. While I'm a sort of a geek on culture, I love it. I know it has an impact. And if you were to say to me, Jamie, how do you know? I just know. I've seen it. I've seen the absence of strong culture. I've seen the impact of great culture. But the way you're tying that, you're creating that direct line to shareholder value is something I've never heard expressed in that way and is really helpful. So thank you for that.
Well, I think, yeah, and I agree. I mean, it's kind of like advertising. People believe in it, but you can't really measure it, all that kind of stuff, which again, I don't subscribe to. But we probably saw this during the Great Resignation, right? If you had an employee workforce that wasn't engaged, you had huge turnover. Your normal turnover, healthy turnover in our companies was between 10 and 20%. And suddenly they were, you know, exploding to 40, 50% turnover. And it's because they didn't have an engaged workforce. Believe me, that caught financial people's attention because it made a huge business impact when you're having to replace people at that rate. So yeah,
Absolutely.
it's measurable.
Excellent. It's so fascinating to me, David, to be able to talk to you. We started talking about like metrics and KPIs and the sort of the operational fundamentals of running a business, and then we've veered all the way over to culture. I love the breadth of that and the depth in each area. Um, you spoke to me when we first met about something I want to make sure that my audience hears. The tension line between being data driven and maybe overdoing that sometimes, because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I am a data geek. I love data. I
Me
was
too.
a math major in school, so data is really important to me. But what I've come to learn over time is that, we had actually used this expression in my company: use data to validate, not to formulate. People's experience, their knowledge, their ability to turn on a dime, their ability to see other insights that you don't catch, is as important, is more important than the data itself. Now, once you put a strategy in place, measure it, establish what the success metrics are, measure it, course correct when they don't measure up, and so on. There are leading indicators that say, hey, things are going to, not going the right way, or they're going the right way, and you got to change or not change. So I'm all in favor of that. But ultimately, this is a really interesting topic when you start thinking about AI. There's a human element to this, right? And is AI going to replace that? Um, I don't think so. But AI is using tons and tons and tons of data to make informed decisions. And I think as it gets better, those things do start to converge. But ultimately, you still need to formulate, align people around that, and part of alignment is your belief in it. If it's spit out by ChatGPT, not that I'm faulting that, but is that going to get people's buy-in? Now, can you use large language models and so on and so forth to help you with it? Absolutely. But ultimately, don't forget what we're trying to do. You're trying to get alignment in an organization and trying to build and drive culture. And you do that through formulating a vision and then validating that you formulated the right vision. So to me, use data to validate, not to formulate, because data in and of itself is not going to build the energy. It's not going to build the alignment. You're going to have to take that, create the vision, build alignment, build energy around it.
There's something oddly encouraging about what you just said, because you're basically saying, hey, data as a tool, a great tool, you better be, I learned this well at Microsoft. You better know the fundamentals and the data of your business inside and out. It's like ticket to the
Absolutely.
dance, right? And what I'm hearing you say though, and as a leader, trust your intuition, pull in everything that you're seeing around alignment in the organization and focusing on culture. The data becomes a tool. It's not what is driving you day in and day out per se.
There's nothing more frustrating than sitting in a board meeting and going through, let's say it's a problem, and someone has just talked about, we're having a problem in this area with this product or whatever, and they go through all this data, we're down 10% of retention, new sales bookings, so on, so on. And then you ask the question, so what do you think we should do? And there's silence and there's turning of pages, and there's, you got to have that human element that says, let me formulate a strategy. Here's data. Okay, it's going to help me. I'm going to formulate the strategy, and we're going to course correct, and then I'm going to validate that that's working. And if I don't do that, what good is the data? So yeah,
Amazing.
I
Well, David, gosh, I feel like I could talk to you for hours, and I wish I could. Maybe we'll have to do a reprise. We'll do a reprise on a
sounds
couple
good.
topics.
Sounds good.
I am curious before we wrap up, though, if there are any books or, and you gave us a great framework with your own framework, the Energy Creator Framework, any books or frameworks that you think would be useful to my audience to take a look at?
Yeah, there's one. It's so old that I almost hesitate to recommend it, but there's a book by John Kotter, who was a Harvard business professor, called "What Leaders Do."
Oh,
And it talks about the different, just read, if you don't read the whole book, read chapter 3.
okay.
It talks about the difference between leaders and managers, and there's a huge difference. And it gets into things like, leaders thrive on change. Managers try to control the change. Leadership is about coping with that change. He uses the example, if you're at peacetime, then your army needs management. But if you're at wartime, you need leadership.
Hmm.
And there's a difference between setting a direction and operating a plan. And also, leadership, just like energy, doesn't have to come just from the top. Management, by definition, is hierarchical. You build an org chart, people report to other people. Leadership, there's no hierarchy involved. And so I think understanding the difference between leadership and management, even though this book was written in the 1990s, is still relevant today. And so I would recommend that.
Some of the best books, I think, are the ones that stand the test of time. So
They do. They do.
I look forward to taking a look at that, especially chapter 3. You know, one thing that strikes me as I listen to everything you said today, I'm taking away this idea that there's tension lines or there's the different things, but it's about intentionality. For example, when am I in the learning zone? When am I in the performance zone? When do I really need to lean into my leadership capabilities, and when does the team need management? Right? Like that's I think I don't know, something I'm picking up from you about the intentionality of the way you lead and you really guide these companies. So.
Well, I think also because some leaders are just more natural at it than others, whether through charisma or, you know, eloquence of speaking or whatever it might be. And I'm not one of those. So I have to be intentional. And so I don't find that as a flaw. I actually think that's a blessing because I think it makes me a better leader by planning what I do and understanding why it is what I do and making sure other people understand that it doesn't come naturally. So, yeah, I think there's an element to intentionality that's really important, especially for energy repeaters like myself.
I don't know. I think today I would give you high stars on the generating energy. You would have gotten high stars in your Microsoft review for generating energy because my
Okay,
synapses are firing. I've got like tons of stuff I want to look up and practice, and I'm sure that my audience picked up a lot of nuggets today. So thanks. So
good.
as we wrap, could you just share one piece of leadership advice? If you could only give one piece of advice to being a great leader, what would that be?
Probably something extremely simple, because I'm a simple person. Just do the right thing. If you do the right thing, it's going to come out right, or at least you stand a much better chance. And you know what the right thing is. As a human being, as a leader in an organization, as a manager in an organization, you know what the right thing is. It's like the example you asked me about before. If somebody's an energy detractor, well, do the right thing for the organization and for that person. That's a simple decision. There's lots of times you'll be faced with whether it's a people situation or a business situation, a customer situation, investor situation. Um, Most people find common ground in what the right thing is. It's how you get there is usually the negotiation, but most people, at least I like to believe, most people find common ground in what the right thing is. So do the right thing, and that will serve you well.
What a great way to end. I've heard do the right thing a lot. Pairing it with and it will come out right, I think is brilliant. So thanks for that. Well, David,
My
I
pleasure.
really appreciate your time today. I enjoyed our conversation.
So did I.
I'm not kidding about the reprise. There's like a lot I didn't get to today that I would really love to. Maybe I'll come down to Tampa. We'll do a big Tampa. There seems to be a lot of great
Sounds good.
leaders in Tampa. Tampa reprise at some point. Thank you
Sounds
very,
good.
very much, and good luck to you and all the companies that are fortunate enough to have you advising them.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Please continue to join us for insider access to executive leadership.